Okay, so chapter 10 is all about photosynthesis, which remember is the opposite reaction of cellular respiration. That plants, all organisms do cellular respiration, but not all organisms do photosynthesis. So photosynthesis is the process that converts blank energy. What kind of energy? Well, the energy comes from the sun, so that's solar energy, into, remember the whole purpose of photosynthesis was to make what molecule? Glucose. And what kind of energy is in glucose? That's chemical energy. So we have an energy conversion here. So directly or indirectly, photosynthesis nourishes almost the entire living world because either you're a photosynthetic organism and make your own food, or you're an organism that eats the plants directly, or eating another organism that eats the plants. So what's the name of something that can sustain themselves without eating anything derived from other organisms, those doing photosynthesis? And that is an autotroph. Auto means self, autotrophs. These guys, autotrophs, are and another way to say that is producers of the biosphere. So it produces organic molecules like glucose using the CO2. All right, so then almost all plants are, and plants are what we call photoautotrophs, meaning that they make their own food. Photo means light, from the energy in sunlight. Some organisms, like on the bottom of the ocean, where there's no light there, their producers can't do photosynthesis. Their producers are called autotrophs, which they get their energy from chemicals. All right, and they actually use the sulfur gases coming out of the hydrothermal vents at the bottom of the ocean and can convert that into molecules used for food, and therefore they can sustain other organisms that eat them and so on, so you can have this whole ecosystem on the bottom of the ocean without any sunlight. So where does photosynthesis occurs? We all know that it occurs in plants, but also algae, some protists. These guys are unicellular organisms, often found in fresh water, and some prokaryotes. What's a prokaryote? Basically, bacteria can do that. So therefore, there's a variety, but the majority are plants. And so this gives you some pictures of that. So the plants, what algae looks like. Here's a little protist like the paramecium, some bacteria, and so on that do photosynthesis. So then, if we have to eat or get organic material from other organisms, we call those heterotrophs. So these guys would be where we are. So another word for heterotrophs we are the consumers of the biosphere. So almost all heterotrophs, including us as humans, depend on photoautotrophs, those organisms doing photosynthesis, for food, for glucose to get our energy, but also what gas? Oxygen. All right, so let's look at this big energy conversion of photosynthesis. Converts light energy to the chemical energy of food. So blank are the organelles that are responsible for feeding the vast majority of organisms. Can you put that? What organelle does photosynthesis occur in? You should have wrote chloroplasts. And chloroplasts are present in a variety of photosynthesizing or photosynthetic organisms. So let's just do a quick little review of the chloroplast, site of photosynthesis. Blank are the major locations of photosynthesis. When you think of a plant, where does most photosynthesis occur? It occurs in the leaves. Their green color is from, do you know the green pigment that's found within chloroplast? You should have chlorophyll. When I ask these questions, you can pause it and see if you can think of it if you're not thinking of it, if I'm not giving you enough time. So you can pause it and check yourself. So then blank energy absorbed by chlorophyll drives the synthesis of organic molecules, that's your glucose, in the chloroplast. What kind of energy? Light energy or solar energy. Through microscopic pores called, you guys remember the pores at the bottom of the leaf? Stomata. Remember, when I acted like a leaf, and my arm was or acted like a tree, and my arm is like the branch, and my hands are like the leaves, and you have these pores on the bottom that open and close that allow gas exchange. So CO2 enters and O2 leaves for photosynthesis. Chloroplasts are found mainly in the cells of the mesophyll layer. This is probably new for you, the interior tissue of the leaf. A typical mesophyll cell has a bunch of chloroplasts, 30 to 40 chloroplasts. The chlorophyll is in the membrane of, do you guys remember the little sacs inside the chloroplast? They're thylakoids. Connected sacs in the chloroplast. The thylakoids are stacked, so each individual one is a thylakoid. And then they're stacked, the whole stack is called grana, or granum if it's singular. So chloroplasts also contain, there's a fluid called the stroma. So this is the chloroplast. Chloroplast has a double membrane, just like the mitochondria. It's not folded, and that's because the membranes aren't important for photosynthesis. What is important is the thylakoid membrane. So you have lots of these stacks here of these thylakoids or granum. And the liquid that it's all floating around in is the stroma. So if we look at the next picture here, this shows you the organization of your leaf and of the plant. So this is a cross section of your leaf. All right, so you have, let's do some color coding here. Usually at the top of the leaf, what they don't have here is you have what's called a cuticle. This is usually a waxy waterproof layer that's involved in water retention. And then, as you see here, this part right here underneath, this part right here is the epidermis, kind of like our skin. It's a single layer of cells. So that's what we have here. And then underneath here is that mesophyll layer that we're talking about. So the mesophyll layer, I'll put this in green, is where the photosynthetic cells are. All right, and so this is where most photosynthesis occurs. All right. These guys here, notice that this is all the mesophyll layer. These guys here are kind of more jumbled up. There's space in between the cells. There's air space where these guys are more tightly packed. This is sometimes called the spongy mesophyll layer down here because it has pores and so on. The reason why is because if we look towards the bottom here are those stomata, those pores that open and close. So when CO2 comes in, they have to diffuse through the spaces between these spongy cells to get to the cells where most of your photosynthesis occurs. And all these little black dots in here are the chloroplasts in those cells where photosynthesis occurs. So, so when we're looking at this is the top of the leaf, and this is the bottom of the leaf. And we can write here for stomata, this is the site, this is for gas exchange, which is what we just talked about here. All right, and so the only thing on this picture now we haven't talked about is this vein. The vein is what carries water. So right here, the vein, all right, is where water comes up from. So for the vein, water goes into the roots at the bottom of the plant, goes all the way up through that tunnel system called the xylem, all the way up the plant to the branches, and then into the veins where it diffuses out, and these guys can use the water. And so that's the purpose for that. So look at here. If we look at enlarging this one cell, so they took this one cell enlarged it. This is a real picture. So here's the one mesophyll cell. All of these guys are all your little chloroplasts. If we took one chloroplast and enlarged it, here's a computer-generated picture of what it looks like. And so as we talked about, inner and outer membrane, thylakoid, they did a cutaway so you can see that inside the thylakoid there's space. They call it the thylakoid space. And so the granum is one singular. Grana, remember, is plural. But it's talking about a stack of these thylakoids, and then this is a real picture of it, all right? And so that's kind of the whole gist of where in the plant photosynthesis occurs, and specifically inside the cells in the chloroplast. So we're going to be building on this. So let's look at, it says tracking atoms through photosynthesis. Photosynthesis can be summarized as the following equation. I said write it below. So pause it here and see if you can write the equation for photosynthesis, remembering it's the exact opposite of cellular respiration. Okay, so you should have 6 CO2 plus 6 H2O plus light, energy, solar energy, something along the lines, gives you 6 C6H12O6 plus 6O2. All right, so that is your equation for photosynthesis. So let's look at the next page here. We're going to start to look at what happens to this. Photosynthesis is a redox reaction just like cellular respiration. So it's an oxidation reduction reaction. So basically CO2 is going to gain hydrogen and become glucose. And water, the oxygen in water, is going to become the oxygen that's given off, and it's going to lose hydrogen. So the splitting of water. Chloroplasts split water into, water is made out of 2 atoms, so what 2 atoms would they going to be? Hydrogen and oxygen. And so we can color code to show this. So here are your reactants. So that's what we just wrote on the other side. 6 CO2s and... Oh, I forgot to tell you. I forgot that they did this. Let's go back to the equation here with this. This is the equation that we need to know. I'm going to put here, though, they have a real equation, and I don't know why some books have it, some books don't. Actually, the real equation for photosynthesis actually has 12 waters. So if we look here, 6 CO2 plus 12 waters going in plus light gives you glucose, C6H12O6 plus 6O2, but there are also 6 waters coming out. And so I thought I was going to run out of room here. 6 waters coming out. And so what they did, this is what you need to know, but what they did, and most textbooks do, is reduce. They say, all right, if 12 waters go in and 6 waters go out, then let's just say then that really the net is 6 waters going in, and let's not put any waters going out. And so therefore, that's where we get this equation here. All right, and so this is the same for cellular respiration as well. Cellular respiration, realistically, you have water going in and 12 waters going out, 6 waters going in and 12 waters going out, but we just need to know the reduced reaction. So anyway, so what really happens is this, so that's what this is showing you here. So let's color code the reactants. Let's put the CO2s from carbon dioxide in red. So you might want to pause this if you want to get some colors. 6 CO2s, and let's make water blue. There's your water. So then what this is showing you is during a chemical reaction, the bonds break and the atoms reform to make different molecules than what you originally had. So here are your products. So this is showing you, these arrows are showing you that the carbons and oxygens that were once part of carbon dioxide are now going to become the carbons and oxygens in glucose. All right, so therefore, and then the rest of the oxygen is going to become the oxygen in water. Then Where's the H come from? The H comes from water. So therefore, when these bonds are between the hydrogen and oxygen are broken, the hydrogen goes to the hydrogen here, and the oxygen is the oxygen that the plant gives off. All right, and so that's where the O2 comes from. So this shows you the destination, I guess, of the reactions. So then, as I said, this is a redox reaction. So when we look at the reactants and what happens to them, one of these two, carbon dioxide or water, is going to become oxidized or lose electrons, and one is going to become reduced or gain electrons. And so, and you can think of losing and gaining electrons in terms of, in this case here, losing and gaining hydrogen. So I want you to try and fill in, pause this and see if you can fill in this bullet. All right, so photosynthesis is a redox process in which what is oxidized? Water loses the hydrogen and becomes O2, and so therefore water lost electrons via the hydrogen, and what gained it, the C's and O's gain of carbon dioxide gained hydrogen, so carbon dioxide is reduced. So this is also a redox reaction, like cellular respiration. All right, so let's give an overview of what actually happens during photosynthesis. There are two main stages. The first one, it says photosynthesis consists of, we have the light reactions. That's the photo part, all right, of photosynthesis. And then we have the synthesis, the making, and that's the Kelvin cycle. That's where we're going to actually make our end product. What's our big end product of photosynthesis? We want to make, or the plant wants to make, glucose. And so those are your two main parts. So it's a little bit less than cellular respiration. So the light reactions in the thylakoids split. Actually, I'm going to come back to this after we go through the picture, because I'm going to have you try and fill this out on your own. So if you refer back to this picture here, not back, ahead, and we'll come back to those three bullets here. This is the overview of photosynthesis. And so when we look at here, there are two main stages of photosynthesis that we just wrote about here. Stage number 1, which is the light reactions, and stage number 2, which is the Kelvin cycle. So those are your two. This right here is the whole chloroplast. These are your thylakoid stacks, your granum, and this is the Kelvin cycle, and the liquid. The liquid inside is your stroma. All right, so this is your stroma. Okay, so what happens? Let's color code this again. All right, so here comes H2O. So I'm going to make H2O blue. Here comes H2O. And notice here H2O comes in and is used in the light reactions. The light reactions happen first. The light reactions also use light, hence the name, the light reactions. So what happens is that when we look at the membrane of a thylakoid, so I'm going to get a black marker here, kind of outline. So here's your thylakoid membrane right here. Embedded in the thylakoid membrane are pigments, and these pigments, like chlorophyll, are embedded in there. So here's a chlorophyll, here's chlorophyll, so they're in the membrane. So this is chlorophyll. And the purpose of the pigments are to absorb the light energy. So that's why the light is coming in here. And so pigments absorb light energy. And so and they're part of that membrane. And there are green pigments like chlorophyll, but then there are also other pigments. Anthocyanins are red, carotenoids are orange. So the chlorophyll for sure is not the only pigment in the membrane of the thylakoid that's used to absorb light energy. But the pigments are really important. And so, overview of the light reactions. Water comes in, and remember, we just learned that we're going to split water into hydrogen and oxygen. So it's the energy from the sunlight, and we'll get into it a little bit more later, that splits this water. And so the water, when it splits, the oxygen part of water is going to be released as O2, and this is going to go into the atmosphere. So this is going to go back into the atmosphere, leave the plant through those stomata at the bottom of the leaves, and organisms like us can breathe in that oxygen. So what are we left with? We're left with the H's of water. So notice here, two things coming out of the light reactions. Going out of here, we have ATP and we have NADPH. NADPH sounds an awful lot like what? NADH. And what did NADH do in cellular respiration? It carried electrons. And so that is exactly what NADPH does in this particular case. So NADPH is carrying electrons, and I'm going to make this H blue from the H's from the water. So it's carrying electrons, all right, that used to be part of the hydrogen of water. And then also notice what comes out of here is ATP. So some of this light energy is actually used to phosphorylate ATP or ADP to make ATP. So that's why if you look up here, there are, so what comes in here is NADP plus becomes NADPH, kind of like NAD plus in cellular respiration became NADH. So therefore it grabs two electrons, one to neutralize and one in the hydrogen, just like NAD plus does, and then the energy from the light phosphorylates ADP to make ATP. So therefore these two things are actually used in the second stage, which is called the Kelvin cycle. So if we look here, what the Kelvin cycle uses, and I'll pick another color here, the Kelvin cycle is where CO2 is used. And the CO2, the Kelvin cycle is just like the Krebs cycle, is a cycle of chemical reactions. So you start out with, if this is molecule X, you recycle it and it becomes molecule X at the end. This is all happening in the stroma. So the CO2 comes in and goes through a series of reactions. These series of reactions takes ATP energy, hence the light reactions make the ATP that's used in the second set. And then the CO2, as it goes through these reactions, NADPH drops off the hydrogen with the electrons, and the CO2 and the hydrogen electrons are used to make your glucose. So over here, when we look at this, you have the C and the O from the carbon dioxide, and the H's come from NADPH, which started out as hydrogen to make your sugar. And notice here your sugar, it says CH2O because that's the basic overview. This could be glucose, C6, H12O6, double as many hydrogens as carbons and oxygens. All right, so that's why that says that here. And then the sugar is used either in the mitochondria. Right away, it'll go to the mitochondria. So if it's the plant, the sugar is going to go to the mitochondria. And what happens in the mitochondria? It's used for cellular respiration, or it's going to be stored for later use. And it's when we eat the plant that the energy we're getting from the plant is the stored energy for later use. Okay, and so therefore plants do more photosynthesis than they do cellular respiration, and therefore have excess glucose, which is a good thing for every single other thing on Earth that we have food to eat. And so that the Kelvin cycle, then we make the sugar, and then we regenerate molecule X, and it can react with another CO2, and so on and so forth. Then notice that when the ATP is used, it becomes ADP and a phosphate again, and NADPH, once it drops off its hydrogen and electrons, become NAD plus again, and then they can come back over here and go through another light reaction, and so on and so forth. So sometimes they call Calvin cycle the dark reactions as well. It doesn't mean that it happens in the dark. It happens anytime, but it doesn't use light directly, hence, all right, so, but sometimes you'll see that written or talked about it in terms of that, okay? All right, so now what I'd like you to do is pause it and go back to these 3 bullets and see if you can fill them in. All right, so let's see how you did. The light reactions in the thylakoids split. You should have water. Release what goes back into the atmosphere, O2. And then it says produce and form. That's kind of hard to know which one is which, what would go into each one of those, because they're kind of the same thing. But in one blank you should have ATP, and the other blank you should have NADPH. Then the Calvin cycle in the stroma forms sugar, or if you had glucose there, that would be fine as well, from CO2 using ATP and NADPH. The Calvin cycle begins with, I forgot, you probably don't know this one. It's called carbon fixation. And this means incorporating CO2 into organic molecules. So we're fixing the carbon. So the CO2, if we go back over here, the CO2 goes in and is going to become part of an organic molecule, and the C's and the O's are actually going to be part of the sugar molecule, and so on. All right, and that's the general overview. So if we wrote the big picture as far as what's the purpose of the light reactions, the purpose of the light reactions is not to really make oxygen. The purpose of the light reactions is to generate ATP and NADPH. So let's put underneath here, makes ATP and NADPH for light reactions. Or for Calvin cycle, thinking of the light reactions. And then the purpose of this is it makes glucose. And we can write here purpose. And so here's for the light reactions, here's for the Calvin cycle. All right, so we're going to start to look now more in depth now that we have this big picture of the light reactions. Okay, so if we look at introduction, all right, so chloroplast, solar-powered chemical factories. Solar-powered because of light, chemical factory, it's producing glucose. Their thylakoids transform light energy, here's the light energy, into the chemical energy of what 2 molecules do we get that has energy? ATP and NADPH. So let's look at sunlight coming in. Light is a form of electromagnetic radiation or energy called electromagnetic radiation. So this is a little bit of a review, I think, maybe for some people about light from a physical science class in your past. Like other electromagnetic energy, light travels in rhythmic waves. So it travels like this in waves. Wavelength is the distance between crests of the waves. So therefore, from right here to right here, that distance. All right, what'd that be? Wavelength determines the type of electromagnetic radiation. Different types will have different wavelengths. So some have longer wavelengths, some have shorter wavelengths, so there's less distance between those crests. Light also behaves as though it is consisting of particles. Those are called photons. So you may have heard of a photon of light. All right. So on this side here, the electromagnetic, we call it the spectrum, is the entire range of electromagnetic energy or radiation, so all the different types. Visible light consists of colors that we can see, including wavelengths that drive photosynthesis. So let's look at this here. So this is the spectrum: gamma rays, X-rays, UV or ultraviolet. That's ultraviolet, like from the sun. And this little section here is the visible light spectrum that we can see. We can't see these other things, types of radiation with our naked eye: infrared, microwaves, radio waves. So visible light is what is used in photosynthesis, and to our eyeballs, all of the colors of light collectively appear white. So this is white light, visible light. If you take white light and split it using a prism, I'm sure you've used prisms before where it splits the white light, and then you can see the whole rainbow of colors. And so I'm going to show you here this because it's colored. So in your book also, it's this figure 10.6 in your book. Oops, the light is kind of shining on it here, but you might want to write the colors. So purple all the way to red, so it's the rainbow going backwards. So if we just write here, this is where you would have your purple, and then you would have, or violet, you'd have indigo in there, then you'd have blue, then we get to green, and then you get yellow in here, that's the lighter shade here, and then you get your orange, and then you get your red. And so Roy G. Biv backwards there, okay? And so notice here it says shorter wavelength to longer wavelength. So everything on the left is shorter wavelengths. All the way to the right is the higher, longer wavelengths. So visually, if we were to write that, and kind of show you here, down here, when it says shorter wavelength, what that means is they're close together, here they're traveling like this, and then as you go to longer, then they get farther and farther and farther and farther and farther apart, all right, the crests. And so that's what that means. And the shorter they are, the shorter the wavelength, the higher the energy, and lower the energy. And so that's what that means here. And so purple has more energy than red, all right, that part of the spectrum. Gamma rays, damaging to cells. Same thing, X-rays can be damaging to cells, can damage DNA, so can UV light, and so on. That's because the shorter wavelength, they have higher energy, they're more damaging, and then radio waves are not. They have the longer wavelengths. So that's your electromagnetic spectrum. So let's relate this now to photosynthesis. So then remember, our pigments, our photosynthetic pigments, are light receptors, and they are going to absorb the light energy. All right, so what are the substances that absorb visible light? In general, they are called pigments. Different pigments absorb different wavelengths of light. So different pigments, some will absorb green, some will not, some will absorb red. Wavelengths that are not absorbed are reflected or transmitted. Leaves appear green because chlorophyll reflects and transmits green light. So that's what this picture here is showing you. So this picture shows you the chloroplast. Here's the light coming in, and remember that your pigments are in the membrane of these thylakoids. So you have pigments here, you have green pigments like chlorophyll, and you have red pigments like anthocyanin, and you have orange pigments, and so on and so forth. So you have all these different pigments. Some of that light is absorbed, so that's the part that and then some of it, notice here, is reflected back to your eye or transmitted. And so for chlorophyll, what's happening is the chlorophyll, when white light shines on it, going back to here, light from the sun has all these colors. It's white light from the sun. It's the whole spectrum, but not all of the visible light is absorbed. And so some of it's reflected. So for chlorophyll, if we look at chlorophyll, the reflected light is in the green-yellow range. And so hence it doesn't absorb green or yellow. So that's the same thing for transmitted light, green-yellow range. And so that's why we see it, because it's not being absorbed, it's being reflected back to our eyeballs, and therefore if the plant has a lot of chlorophyll in it, we see the plant as green. The absorbed light, it absorbs more in the, let's put it over here, in the purple, blue range and the red range is where it absorbs. And so that's the light energy that's used in the light reactions for photosynthesis, is that kind. So therefore, not the part that's transmitted. So all pigments do this. They absorb certain colors or wavelengths of light and reflect. And so the same thing goes true with if you have a pigment that your clothes are made out of. So clothes, if we just think about this, clothes, they're black. Let's talk about black and white clothes. All right, so when white light shines on black and white light shines on white clothes, black versus white clothes, when white light shines on black clothes, all of it is absorbed. So all of it's absorbed, nothing is reflected back, and that's why it appears black. In white, when you have a white shirt and you put white light on it, all is reflected back to your eye, and that's why it appears white. This is also why wearing black clothing outside in the summertime in the heat, in the sun, makes you hotter, because it's absorbing all those wavelengths, where it's cooler with white because it is reflecting all of those wavelengths. So if you have a red shirt, the red shirt is absorbing part of the white light and reflecting, if it's appearing red to our eyes, it's reflecting red light back to us. All right, so that's how that works. So when we look at what part or what's used or what pigments are used for photosynthesis, we use a gadget called a spectrophotometer. It measures a pigment's ability to absorb various wavelengths. This machine sends light through the pigments and measures the fraction of light transmitted at each wavelength. So if we look at this here, this is the machine, and in the machine is a light bulb, and then you can put a solution, in this case of a pigment, so we used chlorophyll. So this is a solution of chlorophyll. You actually put in the machine, there's an opening, so this is the machine here. There's an opening that has a little lever that you can, a little thing that you can open and put a test tube in. And so you put the test tube of chlorophyll in it. And then there's a little dial that lets you pick which wavelength of light. So what wavelength is this? And when you turn this little dial, it takes this white light that shines on a prism and separates the white light into all the various wavelengths or colors of light. And then you can pick and say, okay, I only want to shine green light on the chlorophyll. So here's my green light, my wavelength of just green light. So I'm going to put here green light. Now think back, does green light, is it absorbed by chlorophyll? Green light is not absorbed by chlorophyll. It is reflected and transmitted. So therefore, we're going to have a lot transmitted over here to this photoelectric tube, which then tells us what percent of the light is actually being transmitted. So therefore, you can see it's almost to 100. And that's because all of the green light is not being absorbed by your chlorophyll. And so it's very close to 100%, and we have a very high transmittance. Indicates that chlorophyll absorbs very little green light. All right, so then when we look at what's going on with this one, in this case here, we took the dial and took the same chlorophyll solution, but we're transmitting and changed the wavelength. And now if we look here, it's a little different part of the spectrum. We're transmitting blue light. And now notice here, some blue light is transmitted, but not as much as the green light over here. And so therefore, it's very close to zero, not quite at zero, but very low transmittance. Indicates that chlorophyll absorbs most blue light. So this right here, whenever there's a high transmittance, you're going to have a low absorbance. Do you see the difference there? Because if that color or wavelength of light is transmitted, it's not being absorbed. So therefore, that's two ways to say the same thing. And so that's the same case over here, where we have low transmittance indicates that we have a high absorbance, because if not very much is transmitted, it must be absorbed. So therefore, chlorophyll, looking at chlorophyll, we can assume then that blue light is used for chlorophyll and used for photosynthesis, but green light is not. And before we get into this, this was where we'll stop for part 1.